Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We are not going to fixate on Lee, Margot, or Nigel, even as he does begin to develop out over the eastern Atlantic and move off to the west-northwest. No, today we're going to look at the macro scale and the synoptic scale weather pattern across North America and the North Atlantic to its entirety and discuss exactly why this could play a prevalent role in the next segment of hurricane season. If we do get something to develop behind Nigel, or God forbid, in Caribbean Sea because of that gyre trying to fire something out at us once again like some of the models have been hinting towards, that could spell trouble for the Southeast and the Gulf Coast and especially our Caribbean island friends. So we're wasting no time today, let's jump right in. Alrighty, Weather Center viewers, thank you for joining me for another iteration of Weather Center Nazario. Let's get right into this. This is National Hurricane Center's homepage. Our triple threat is still present over the Atlantic AOR. Both Lee and Margot have actually weakened once again over the last 12 to 24 hours. Margot now represented as a tropical storm with maximum sustained winds of 65 mile per hour in the center, and her central pressure is rapidly climbing. From yesterday, we saw mid 970s up to 980. Now we're up to 990, which is very reminiscent of this tropical storm intensity. She still is anticipated to do some anticyclonic pinwheeling out over the east and central Atlantic before shooting out over to the northeast, no longer playing a role in anybody's weather for that matter. Hurricane Lee also continues to go through a weakening trend as he transitions rapidly now off to the north and northeast at 18 miles per hour. He's really starting to pick up some forward momentum, and this could spell good news for the northeastern coastline under his impacts later on into tomorrow and Sunday. I do anticipate he's going to fully undergo tropical cyclone de-intensification, or I should say the transition to a post-tropical entity before he fully works his way inland over Nova Scotia, parts of New England, and even the eastern periphery of Maine. Tropical Depression 15 is brand new to the Atlantic fray. You can see here that we are expecting a named storm status as early as later this afternoon, if not late this evening upon the 11 p.m. advisory. You can see that National Hurricane Center has the S symbol just out ahead of where we are currently as of 11 a.m. on Friday. This storm is expected to intensify into a possible major hurricane towards the back end of this forecast cone. I personally am going to be a little wishy-washy about that, truthfully, just because a lot of our deterministic models and some of our high-res models indicate we could see something borderline Cat 2, maybe approaching that Category 3 threshold. I don't think we're going to see him duke it out with the likes of Lee, who really intensified into a Category 5. We may not even get a Category 4 out of Nigel as it accelerates off to the northwest. It will get close to Bermuda. We're watching you guys very closely out there. A lot of our ensembles as of today, especially earlier this morning, want to keep the center off to your east, which would be great news in terms of what you kind of would see with its influence as it gets closer and closer to the island. But I will admit the Euro ensembles still have about 40 to 50% agreement of the center potentially tracking right over the island of Bermuda before finally ejecting off to the northeast. So we're watching you guys closely. I know I have a few viewers out on the island, and I'm making sure to keep you guys in the back of my mind, in my back pocket, for all the updates concerning Nigel once he continues to further consolidate and deepen into a tropical storm and inevitably a hurricane. This is a wide view perspective of our Atlantic AOR using the visible satellite shop catered by Tropical Tidbits. You can see that Hurricane Lee off the northeastern coastline is looking a lot more extratropical than it has been throughout its entire life cycle and is really continuing to transition quickly into that post-tropical feature that we had mentioned yesterday during Weather Center. His southernmost base is completely washed out almost to an extent, and you can actually see hints of cold air working its way along his base, and he is expected to pick up frontal support and jet support aloft very soon as he begins to make his way into the eastern Canadian region. A lot of his cloud shield looks a lot more stratiform in nature as well. We've lost a lot of those towering convective complexes that we'd see in a warm core tropical system, and he definitely looks more reminiscent of a post-tropical, if not even a baroclinic low, working its way in towards his suspected landfall location. If you look very closely at Margot, she has now started a very, very, very slow south and southeastward trend in her path. She's kind of situated over the same Latin long line we saw yesterday, and is expected to slowly go clockwise in this sort of fashion before ejecting out rapidly over the North Atlantic. Taking a look now at Tropical Depression 15, albeit we've lost some of the thunderstorm activity that managed to blossom up overnight yesterday as we woke up this morning. It is looking a lot more consolidated. That shear that was sort of elongating it during the last two segments of Weather Center that I pointed out has disappeared. We've got taken on a much more symmetrical appearance on satellite, which is very healthy for this storm, and I still do anticipate we'll see Tropical Storm Nigel through the weekend. This system, as well as Hurricane, soon to be post-tropical Tropical Lee are going to play huge roles in what our big picture weather pattern is going to do over the next 7 to 10 days. This is the 6Z Euro. Once again, I always seem to make these videos before we get all of the 12Z data in, and this chart won't populate until all hours and all panels have made it to weathermodels.com, so we're going to use 6Z. 6Z will still give us a pretty apparent picture of what the general trend and consensus is with both model platforms, the Euro and the GFS I'll get to here in a second. As you go through time, we're still anticipating a predominantly northwesterly track deepening down into a Category 2 hurricane with very few ensemble members indicating that we could see Category 3 or greater intensity. That's why I'm a little on the fence that we're actually going to get a major hurricane out of this. We've had some pretty significant upwelling in the wakes of Franklin and Lee now for that matter, and it will be traveling in that same general area. The surface temperatures of the ocean are still conducive for intensification, albeit a little bit more slower and a little more steadily than we saw with Hurricane Lee bombing out into a Cat 5 within a span of 12 hours. So do I see strengthening with Nigel and further intensification? 110%. Do I think we're going to hit major hurricane status? We're going to come close. It definitely has the opportunity to do so, but some of the environmental factors are playing against him as opposed to what they did with Lee last week and even before that as it started to develop out over the Atlantic. Here's a glance at the GFS ensembles as of 6Z as well. 12Z is almost populated. I will go back to that at a later time, and if you tune in for our 8 p.m. Tropics talk tonight, we'll definitely cover all the latest information there. But once again, you can see GFS is in full agreement that we're going to see that northwesterly track. GFS is also starting to dial back a little bit of the intensity as well. We're not seeing any ensemble members indicate that we'll reach major hurricane strength, which is good news for Bermuda, especially after they took the thrashing from Hurricane Lee all throughout the day yesterday and early this morning. We want to watch this next entity closely. You can see our ensemble members once again fanning out across most of the East and Central Atlantic, with a couple of members still whispering to us that we could see something take shape in the Western Caribbean. So we're definitely keeping our eyes peeled, remaining vigilant, head on a swivel, and we're going to talk about exactly why the big picture weather pattern could be a bit more troublesome for us, especially as we get into October and those source regions in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico start to become a little bit more ablaze with activity. Now what we are looking at here is the 850 millibar temperature anomaly chart for Eastern CONUS, and the reason I bring this up is it's going to play a vital role in what our big picture synoptic and macro scale pattern look like over the next couple of weeks. You can see, as I'd mentioned too, on the visible satellite, we're already seeing cold air wrapping around the southern periphery of Hurricane Lee, soon to be post-tropical Lee. This is likely to become a mature wave as it transcends the northeastern coastline and into Canada, in which case he will develop, believe it or not, warm and cold sectors and actually grow an occluded front from his center of circulation, being a warm occlusion since the coldest air in the environment is going to be out ahead of him. This is critical, and I'll explain to you why. Just continue to roll with me, please, okay? Don't hop away from this video just yet. As this continues to happen, you're going to see quite a bit of cold air advection, pretty much encompassing a large majority of the eastern half of the United States and the Great Lakes into Quebec and Ontario. The reason I bring this up is this is going to be a bit anomalous for this time of the year. We are in the middle of transition season going from summer to fall, so we will begin to see more potent fronts come across the continental U.S., but to come down this far south and this far southeasterly into the Atlantic is going to cause a disruption in our overall jet layout over the northern hemisphere, especially over North America and the northern Atlantic. You can see, just looking at our 850 anomaly chart, you could draw what looks to be an 850 cold frontal boundary all the way through central Florida, approaching the central aspects of the Gulf of Mexico, probably working their way down into northern Mexico and Central America at this point, with as much funneling we're going to get between the interaction of the high and hurricane post-tropical cyclone Lee moving northeast, just pulling all that polar air, that modified polar air, down to the south and southeast. You get a really good depiction of this on the Euro model. We're using the 10-meter surface wind chart here, and you can see that as Lee pulls off the corner of the chart there, you see an acceleration in the winds along the Gulf Coast and the mid-Atlantic southeastern states. You can see that in this form right here. All the streamlines are pointing southeast, due south over the Gulf Coast, pushing it into the Gulf of Mexico. What you see there are almost like prefrontal and postfrontal winds because of the gradient force around the developing high in the Atlantic, Lee's influence transitioning to the northeast, and our polar high that's been kind of stagnant over the Great Lakes now being drawn south because of Lee's advection. What this is going to do is leave a fairly potent cold edge. That frontal system moving into the Gulf of Mexico is going to go stagnant until Nigel can pick it up and kind of move it off into another south and easterly direction as well. The reason I bring this up is because I noticed a lot of people are starting to highlight a bit of a low pressure center trying to take shape over the central Florida peninsula, if not just off barely to the east over the Gulf Stream to the northern periphery of the Bahamas. Bahamas. I can tell you right now, this is not going to be tropical in nature. We do not have a tropical depression trying to form off the Florida coastline, and I will explain why. What we're looking at now is the 500 millibar geopotential height chart with the Canadian model, and this is also going to highlight our vorticity. We have what is called a major shortwave, a smaller segment of what we would see in the long wave pattern. We have a major shortwave trough that's wrapped up in our southern base of the trough axis that's extended down in wake of Hurricane Lee across the eastern United States. That shortwave, as we go through time, is going to work its way across the southeast into the state of Florida, and that's going to help to see, there it is right there. You can see that area of embedded vorticity looking a little bit more prevalent on the 12Z model. It's going to dig its way down into the southeast and really help to deepen that surface low. It'll start off as what's called a stable wave until it can really develop a temperature gradient along it, and then it'll try to move off to the north, if not north-northeast, following the jet stream pattern above it. So this will be a stable to an unstable wave. It will not be tropical in nature. It'll be weak because we don't have a whole lot of cold air pulled down over the south, so we won't have the trademark signature baroclinic wave set up with it, but you'll still be able to track fronts, a warm and a cold sector with it as it begins to move off to the north. This is a little bit more apparent as we go down to the MSLP precip chart on the Canadian model as well. You can see we have a lot of shower activity through the weekend and into next week, as a matter of fact, because of the overrunning scenario we have between the warmer climate to its south and that modified polar air to the north of that stationary tail at this point, draped across the southeast and the Gulf of Mexico. As that shortwave trough and the jet digs down to the south once again, you can see we start to undergo cyclogenesis just off the coast, and even though we have so much modified air down in that area, you can kind of pick up on a bit of a cold boundary right in through here and a warm sector starting to develop off to its east. Like so. I know it looks very reminiscent of a tropical feature, but if you go up to 200 and 300 millibars, there's the jet running right over top of it. That shortwave trough is what's helping to undergo the cyclogenesis and develop it into a low-pressure center. It's not tropical in nature. The main reason this is huge for our upcoming transitional pattern between September and into parts of October, especially as we get more disturbances off of Africa, and if the Central American gyre tries to shoot something at us like it did with Idalia not too long ago, that could be a bit troublesome. So now we're looking at the North America AOI. We're going to see how the long wave pattern goes from a bit more zonal, lower amplitude to very high amplitude thanks to the influence of Lee and Nigel along the east coast, even though they're going to stay offshore for the most part. As you go through time, we have a ridge-trough ridge set up over the United States, which has saved us from a lot of the tropical entities that could have affected the east coast. There's our next trough axis that's expected to pick up Nigel and sling him out into open water, posing no substantial threat to the U.S. However, notice how because of his influence drawing that cold air off the coast further into the Atlantic, what it is doing is creating temperature discontinuity along his leading edge and pulling that polar air much further south than what the jet was doing on its own. And as a result, Mother Nature has to respond, and what she's going to do is bring the jet stream further south to find where the most marked temperature discontinuity or temperature contrast is associated. Believe it or not, the only jet on Earth is the subtropical jet that's formed predominantly by conservation of angular momentum and overall just wind speeds, whereas the polar front jet, the northern branch, and even some will say that there's an Arctic jet up there, is actually formed because of baroclinicity, sharp discontinuity in the temperatures equatorward of it and poleward of it, and that's why we're seeing this sudden shift in our macro scale big picture pattern. So as you get to the tail end of the 0-0, you can see that we now have an enormous trough dug in over the southeast. You have the base of the trough almost approaching the Western Caribbean, affecting lights of Cuba, the Bahamas, and even parts of Jamaica and Central America to include the Yucatan Peninsula. And as a result, when one system amplifies and deepens, on either side of it, we have to have a building effect. Just like at the beach, when you have the higher waves, the higher ridges back behind it, there's a lot longer of a subside between wave after wave after wave. It's traditional wavelength, and believe it or not, the pattern in the atmosphere reacts the exact same way. When something grows, on either side, Mother Nature has to respond and accommodate for this growth. So you're going to either have deepening on both sides of a ridge, or you're either going to have building of a ridge on either side of a very quickly deepening trough. And what this is going to do is move that force field, that protective barrier along the east coast of the United States, and a bit of more so of what's been protecting the Caribbean from any major storms, out to the west. The Canadian model, I feel, does an even better job of highlighting this. If you watch as that trough digs in across the east and Nigel begins to pull out, this is the 969 millibar low highlighted here, ejecting out over the extreme North Atlantic following the previous jet max that helped guide Lee out as well. You can see that we have an extremely deep trough, a high amplitude trough over over the southeast, with the low beginning to develop in its cold sector. That's exactly why I know this will not be tropical in terms of its characteristics once it starts to deepen and show itself over the southeast. It will actually be right underneath the jet and eventually drift poleward into the cold sector of the jet. It won't be warm core. And now if you were to kind of draw a bit of a picture, I'll use my pen here and show you that most of the time when we had systems coming in like Lee, Margot even, and Nigel, we had a trough extending out over the east coastline into the western Atlantic, guiding these systems well off to the north and away from any significant landfall. What this does here is it's now going to intensify the ridging we have off the coast and build a blocking ridge over the eastern coastline. And as most of us know, when there's high pressure and there's high ridging in the atmosphere, this is going to drive those storms to the west. I will use the 6Z GFS to demonstrate this because unfortunately there's a little bit of wonkiness going on with the 12 Zulu data on tropical tidbits, so roll with me here. As you go through time and you get that deepening trend along the southeast coast of Florida and you begin to eject that trough axis out, there's another jet max back behind it that's also supporting a potent Colorado low system that's likely to produce severe weather for the Midwest and further eastward as it transitions to the east, supported by that jet axis. With the introduction of that new jet max and that new baroclinic low at the surface, because of the orientation of the long wave pattern, we're going to have what's called split flow take place. Some of that jet energy is going to continue to spill to the southeast and amplify our trough and extending ridge into the Atlantic, while others are going to have it go to the north and spread out over the north and northeastern United States. Now with the introduction of that upcoming jet max, watch what happens to our pattern along the coastline, and especially in the western Atlantic. You get what looks to be a sharp amplitude ridge, a blocking ridge, begin to take shape over the western and central parts of the Atlantic. And the reason this is a little worrisome, especially if we get something forming up in the lower latitudes of the MDR or maybe even the Caribbean Sea, these systems are going to have only one direction to go, and that's westward. Here's about 120 hours out with Hurricane Nigel bearing down on Bermuda, preparing to make his northeast path into the North Atlantic. You can see that we have a frontal boundary draped down to the southwest of our next unstable wave that's also supported by the same jet that kicked Lee out of the big picture. They're all one continuous segment at this point, overrunning the mid-Atlantic ridge. And as both of these systems move east, look at what happens to our high pressure. All that cold air, now that it's being pulled in by the likes of Nigel, a much deeper low than the one previous to it, is going to continue to funnel that cold air off the coastline, and as a result, aloft, that jet's going to trough even further to the south. As this happens, our high-pressure center is going to orient itself over the mid-Atlantic, northeastern states, and the extreme western portions of the Atlantic Ocean. What that means in general is our once favorable weakness in all of these different synoptic features that guided storms through the central and northern Atlantic like so is now going to transition further to the west. Because of that potent high pressure trying to seal itself off, we're actually going to see a weakening trend a little bit further to the west that could put the southeast, Florida, and the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean under the gun for potential tropical impacts. The big kicker here is if we're going to see development and if it'll work its way into that area to be influenced by this new developing long wave pattern. That is the key, and that is what remains to be seen. We have different model platforms, the Canadian, the Euro, and the GFS, even portions of the Icon towards the back end of its run, hinting that we could see some development either in the central and western MDR, and some want to pick something up in the Caribbean and move it due north. So guys, I'm not predicting that we're going to see a landfall in the southeast or along the Gulf Coast. I'm just mentioning that the pattern is going to be a little more favorable for it. It's going to suggest that we could see something move a lot further west than we have for the last couple of weeks with Lee, Margot, and now Nigel, who's expected to eject out to sea, posing no threat to anyone affected by Lee outside of Bermuda. So going forward, we have to watch. Our Canadian model, our Euro model, and the GFS are all hinting towards we could see the same dynamics start to take shape we saw before Idalia finally showed herself over the Western Caribbean. That Central American gyre is likely to fire back up, and we'll see a large region of lower pressure in the Western and Central Caribbean and even portions of the Gulf of Mexico. What that oscillating trend means is we have a lot more upward vertical motion and a more conducive environment to see a convective complex of tropical thunderstorms consolidate and do exactly what Idalia did before moving towards Florida. And the fact that we have potent frontal boundaries coming off of the United States are going to give it a more clear trajectory to the north and inevitably the northeast. The long wave pattern is going to start to shift what was once a protective barrier for the east coastline a little further to the west, so we could see something, if it does form up, move closer and closer to some influence in the United States, in the Caribbean islands, and even further westward for that matter. In conclusion, the big picture pattern is starting to come into place. If we do get the tropical cyclones to continue to fire off as we roll through the back end of peak hurricane season, we'll have to definitely keep an eye out, guys. That's all I'm saying. We'll go ahead and get into the outro now. So there you have it, folks. Not much mentioned about Lee today. I didn't want to fixate too heavily on him as we're still forecasting a lot of the same impacts we've been discussing the last couple of days, and countless other YouTube channels and mass media sources have also been mentioning to a lot of you. No, in reality, I want us to start shifting gears and looking at the macro scale weather pattern because the likes of Lee and Nigel are going to play a bigger role than we anticipate in shaping not only an early seasonal transition to fall, especially for our northern states, but also influencing the weather pattern for the southeast and what could potentially take shape out in the tropics. Don't forget, Climate Prediction Center has a large area of potential source regions as we go into the beginning of October for tropical cyclone development. And if we see something forming closer to the Caribbean or, God forbid, the Western Caribbean, just like Idalia did for us earlier in the season, that could really spell trouble regardless of how you cut it. I do believe we'll have a much clearer picture as we roll into next week and the middle to latter parts of next week in terms of what the big picture pattern's going to do and what the tropics look to do for us as we start to see further development off of Africa and maybe into other source regions highlighted by CPC. I hope to see you tonight at 8 p.m. for our Tropics Talk Eastern Standard Time. We'll be delving into this a little bit more in higher detail in a more casual environment. Check that out. I definitely want to invite you in for some comments, questions, and anything you may have to bring to the table. I'm happy to answer. But until then, guys, this is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.